Hello everyone, I'm Dapper Dan Gvozden, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, which, as long as Mark isn't here, I think we can all agree definitely count. Welcome to the Amazing Spider Talk, the show where two fans and collectors uncover the strange, fun, and fascinating history of the Spider-Man comic universe. Thanks for joining us on this, our Amazing Friends episode of the Amazing Spider Talk. Mark is out, so you'll just be joining me and my special guest for this episode. But if you want to swing along with Mark and me on our journey through Spidey's past, present, and future, subscribe to Amazing Spider Talk on your favorite podcast app and leave us a review to help spread the word about our show. Those reviews are important as they're the best way for us to spread the word about the show and indicate the size of our audience to guests and collaborators. This podcast exists because of the support of our Patreon members. If you want to receive early episodes and exclusive artwork and keep this podcast going, go to AmazingSpiderTalk.com and consider joining our Patreon. Today on the show, I was fortunate enough to talk with writer Mark Hoffmeier. You may not recognize his name, but Mark has been the writer behind many of your favorite Spider-Man stories. He wrote over a dozen episodes of Spider-Man the Animated Series, including the Spider-Wars arc, which has been cited as inspiration for the creation of the Spider-Verse. He worked on the short-lived Spider-Man Unlimited and was a lead writer on the video games Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions and various LEGO Marvel Superheroes titles, and so much more. I was really excited to talk to Mark on the show. I've been trying to get him on for a couple of years now and got sidetracked by COVID and having a kid. But we really dig into all of his work on Spider-Man and the inspiration for the Spider-Verse, whether it did or did not come from the animated series or Shattered Dimensions. And he's just really a great guy. So I think you're going to really enjoy this interview.
Well, now let's meet one of our amazing spider friends. The kind of guy who goes to other friends who recommend. Find out about the things they created. You'll love them so much that you wish you dated. But you're just friends. They're an amazing friend. A friend, a friend, a friend. They're an amazing friend.
All right, listeners, welcome back. I am again joined by writer Mark Hoffmeier. Is it Mayer or Meyer?
It's Meyer, yeah.
Okay, Hoffmeier. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Joining me to talk about his illustrious history on various Spider-Man properties. Thanks for coming on Amazing Spider Talk, Mark.
Oh, thanks for having me, Dan. It's always fun to talk about Spider-Man. He's been a big part of my life, sort of, unintentionally, but it's been good.
Well, it's funny you say that. The first question we like to ask anybody that comes on the show, it's a kind of generic question that I'm sure you've been asked many times about, like, what was your origin story, with these characters? Like, did you encounter them as a child? Were you introduced to them by a family member? Like, and by these characters, I mean Marvel in general, or as specific as Spider-Man. Do you have a kind of core foundational memory or origin story behind that?
Well, I grew up in Honolulu, Hawaii. So as a kid, I was bitten by a radioactive cockroach, and no, that's So interestingly, like all kids, like I was drawn to comic books, and there was an issue though in Hawaii. A lot of the comics I had to read, I got into only sort of as one-offs because the shipping times to Hawaii, I couldn't often read all the books in order and stuff like that. So here's an interesting story. There was a Marvel super team up I remember reading as a kid, and my time was split between growing up in Honolulu, but all my relatives were in the Midwest in Iowa. And I got two copies of the comic in Iowa, I think, or one in Hawaii and one in Iowa, but it was a three book series. And I think it was Iron Man and Spider-Man. It was a Marvel amazing team. It was great.
Okay.
But because of the way the shipping worked between the mainland and Hawaii, I never got to finish it. I didn't actually finish that series till I was in a comic book shop on a Thanksgiving break in college, my freshman year of college. I went with a friend to Arizona, his home in Phoenix, and I finally found the third comic in that series, and I got to finish it.
That's so funny. Did you in Honolulu? What was your kind of like way of picking these up? Were you a spinner rack at the grocery store kind of guy?
Spinner rack at the at either the grocery store or there were little mom and pop markets where a lot of times I would find them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of how I kind of started myself. 5 and 10 cent stores at the beach, and
right.
picking out whatever books they had. Who knew if you were going to get a whole story or not?
Exactly. And as a kid, I was a big fan of Iron Man. I thought Iron Man was great. And here's another reason I liked Iron Man is because I liked to try to draw Iron Man, and Iron Man basically having slits for eyes and a mouth, and that little shine thing they would do where his nose was, right? I was like, well, he's the easiest one to draw, right? It was like, okay, I don't really have to draw hands. I mean, I got kind of into doing the repulsor hands thing, right? But that's why I got so much into Iron Man. But I was aware of all the Marvel comic characters. I was never. As a kid, I was never much of a DC kid. I was not a Batman or Superman kid. I was basically a Marvel kid.
Was there a particular draw to it that kind of pulled you in? I mean, you've done so much writing for Marvel properties over the years. Surely there must be something there that even at a young age attracted you to it? Yeah,
I think, I think it's that attraction that a lot of people have to Marvel characters, and it speaks to sort of the innate storytelling ability of Stan and the other people that were working on those stories, but that ability to have a relatable character, like Peter Parker. He's a superhero, but he's got to get his homework done, or he's got to go pick up eggs, or he's fighting this guy in a rhino suit, but he's got a date with Mary Jane, right? So it's that relatable thing rather than I'm an alien refugee from another planet who is basically impervious to anything. And it made things very, very relatable. I mean, you don't realize till later, though, also that, certain crutches come along with that. Like, in the 60s and 70s, radioactivity was sort of the secret sauce that they would spread on everything. Everything was radioactive. So many of the powers of the heroes came from radioactivity. But they were still relatable, I mean, just sort of the angst of the Hulk, right? I can't get angry or I'll become this raging beast, right? I mean, that's an interest. It's very, very interesting,
Yeah, there's a psychological component to a lot of it, and the world outside your window kind of thing, was
right.
Really apparent. I mean, my first issue was Amazing Spider-Man 375, and, there's a really great Venom story there, but the thing that kind of drew me in the most, I think, was the idea that, like, Peter, after having, like, a meeting like at the Daily Bugle, went up onto the roof and his clothes were webbed up there, and he had to deal with, like, I think pigeons or something nesting in his clothes. Yeah. And that was immediately relatable in some way. I don't know if at an early age I could identify how, like, much of a rule breaking kind of meta wink that was to like, this is not something superheroes do, but it registered nevertheless.
Well, and it also tried to place things in the real world that, like for Superman, stuff was so not a part of reality that we could believe, like, oh, he just puts on horn-rimmed glasses and nobody recognizes him, right? He changes in a phone booth, right? It's like, really? I mean, we all knew phone booths were made basically all of glass. They weren't enclosed. So, right? I mean, it was that kind of stuff that had this sort of, you really had to suspend your disbelief. And sure, you had to do that for a lot of the Marvel stuff too. But they tried to put in that, I mean, Iron Man, right? He's powerful in this suit, but he's got a bad heart, right? I mean, it's like, he's a super wealthy guy, and at that time he couldn't get his heart repaired. So it's like interesting stuff. Everybody has a really great Achilles heel, and that ties into the stories that go back millennia that we all relate to, right?
When you're writing on the various properties that you've worked on for Marvel, is that something that, like, really you put at the forefront of your approach? Is like, if I have an opportunity to highlight the kind of real world elements of these characters, that's something that I make sure to do because that's the appeal of Marvel to me?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think even in the later period of my career when I was working for Lego, and so I got to do some of the Lego Marvel stuff, So you have this, I've always termed Lego as having really great family friendly snark, right? It's like,
Yeah.
it's snarky and funny. And so like I would always find, okay, what are the weird, like in Lego Avengers Reassembled, I did a bit where they're having a party, and I think Hawkeye brings in some meatballs, and Thor says, "Oh, these meatballs are cold. They must be reheated. Sounds like a job for Mjolnir." And the fact that it's ridiculous that he's using his lightning power and his hammer to reheat meatballs. But to me, it's that okay, they exist in the real world, right?
Sure.
How what's going to happen here? And then I wrote a bit after that where Hulk is dancing, and you realize that, like, okay, maybe, dude, you shouldn't dance. I hate to tell you, but
Yeah.
dancing in this building is not, they're not compatible, right? So I think there's always an interface there. It just depends, you can play it for different things. You can play it for drama, which is obvious, right? And the comics often did that. But you can also play it for funny, right? And I think that, webbing up his clothes, right, so that he can come back to them, or if he comes back and they're not there, now what, right? So I think it makes it really, really fun, and just the various approaches of how you look at the characters and how you're going to play it. Whether, okay, I need to play this dramatically, right? Mary Jane's going to break up with him because he had, got in a fight with a chameleon, and he's 2 hours late for the date, right?
Well, I mean, that stuff is kind of, baked in, right? The drama and the comedy, because both of those things are built on contrasts, and,
Right.
like a superhero life kind of provides all of that. So, skipping ahead in your life, like obviously you didn't immediately go writing for television. But like, one of the properties that you've spent a lot of time writing for, and, from my research earlier on in your career, is the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, which, they operate in a very similar way to, the Marvel characters, in that, like, they have high school lives and are blasted away in beams of light to go fight, larger than life foes. And those worlds sometimes, collide, depending on what the budget of the production is, and so on and so forth. Can you tell me about like how you kind of found your way into writing for television, and especially on nerd properties, in that way?
Yeah, well, I started at Hanna-Barbera Productions. I started in the publicity department there, so I was writing, but I was writing specifically publicity and marketing stuff. I did the press kit for the Jetsons movie way back in the day. I remember one time doing an old magazine called TV Guide, which we used to get sent to our doors to tell us what was coming on in TV, and
I still write for them.
So I did a cover. Issue where it was an interview with William Hanna, talking about what modern stars in the late '80s would have been in the Flintstones then, and I ghost wrote it, but I got to interview Mr. Hanna and worked for that.
Cool.
That was really fun because I got to come up with names like, of course we'd have Arnold Schwarzenegger, right, and that kind of stuff, right? So making up ridiculous stuff. But the nice thing was that working in publicity, I got to work with both actors and directors and artists and voiceover artists, and so I got to know the whole process of how animation worked, because I hadn't necessarily studied animation. So that was really fun. And then my first real writing job came. A group of creatives from Hanna-Barbera went and started the family entertainment division at Universal Studios in the early '90s, and I got to go there and do that. And that led to my first television writing assignments on Back to the Future, the animated series, and Fievel, An American Tail.
Yeah.
I think Land Before Time, some of that stuff. So that was really, really fun. And then that led into, in the mid '90s, with Power Rangers. The nice thing was, I was familiar with like the Sentai Rangers and some of those Japanese shows that the Power Rangers were based on, because growing up in Hawaii, we had a Japanese channel, Channel 13, that used to show those things. So my brother and I used to watch them. So I was aware of like Kikaida and Kamen Rider and all that stuff. So that was really interesting to me too, that they were, really Haim Saban was trying to do something, what can I do with this live action property that's toy based, and how do we turn it into an American show that people would want to watch? So yeah, it was kind of an interesting challenge that, it worked, ended up working really well. I had my doubts, but yeah.
Were you familiar with the Japanese Spider-Man as a kid? I mean, I'm sure that
not as a
predated
kid,
but
I'd seen it. Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
of course. It's so Japanese with a giant robot and the big controller on his hand. That kind of stuff. Very Japanesey. But all those shows, right? Ultraman, they were all like that, right? Where giant robots and giant guys fighting in suits and stuff. So, for me, the Power Rangers that was fun was, they would cut 5 to 7 minutes of Japanese footage from the Japanese episodes, which primarily consisted of the climax fight at the end and certain scenes that preceded that. And then we'd have to write an A plot with our Rangers that meshed with that story.
Right.
And so it just became like in a lot of cases. I remember I did an episode called Rocky Just Wants to Have Fun, I think the second season. And it, that was based on, in the Japanese footage, the bad guy enchants a pachinko machine, which makes the Red Ranger want to only fool around. And so that was very evident in the footage. The Red Ranger's just fooling around. So I was like, well, okay, I can take that plot and apply it to ours. But it, in Rocky's case, it applied to what he was doing at school and what he was doing with his friends, and then also what he was doing in the fights. And so it was kind of fun. I mean, it was kind of a fun challenge to try to, it was like a logic problem. How do I make all this stuff work?
It's sort of like the Marvel method in a way. Like Stan would get these pages from Kirby or Ditko and be like, I don't really know what's happening here, but I'm going to fill in the dialogue and see how it all kind of fits together.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, in the Spider-Man meetings that I was in when I moved on then to Spider-Man the Animated Series, that first season, we'd sit and discuss those episodes, almost ad nauseum. I mean, some of our meetings would go 8 hours, right? But you'd be in a room with Stan and the owner of Marvel at that time, Avi Arad, and John Semper as the showrunner, and guys from the network, and you'd all be sitting in this room discussing these episodes, trying to figure it all out. And I would occasionally ask Stan stories. Like, here's a great story I asked Stan. I said, the Hulk started as gray, and then he became green, and of course now there's a whole lore about all that. What's the actual story behind that? And Stan said, he goes, well, the guy from the print shop came up one day and he said, we're having trouble registering the gray. I said, what are the colors you got? He said, we got green. I said, okay. And so, we've imbued it now with all this, like,
sure,
the gray Hulk's the smart Hulk, and the green Hulk, all this meaning and all this, right? Like it is something from Mount Olympus. And you realize that some of that was just Stan getting by day to day. Oh, the gray doesn't work. How about you make him green? Fine.
Sure, and like naming Peter Palmer for 2 issues, and messing that up in the comic. Yeah, it's like,
well, and also, that's also why he used a lot of alliteration, was because he was writing so many comics. That was one of his tricks to keeping everything straight. J. Jonah Jameson, Pepper Potts, Peter Parker. They were, he used all these little tricks to try to, because he'd be writing on all these things, and sometimes it was just a Friday and you needed to get the copy done. Right?
He was doing what, 12 issues a month or something like that.
Yeah, he was the only guy, right?
Yeah.
So it's, it's fortunate for us that he had good instincts for stuff, right? But you can't always, right? As a writer, you're not always it's not always gonna be Shakespeare, because, right, it's also a business. So you also have to keep the stuff coming out, and sometimes it's just like, these lines don't fit, especially in Stan's case. These lines don't fit with what we've drawn. Oh, okay, I'll change it. Here we go. Let's go. Right. And
yeah, I had John Romita Jr. on the show, and I asked him, like, how do you define your style? It's changed over the years from being much closer to his father to now, his more iconographic, style.
Right.
And he said, I call it deadline style. It's like whatever I can get done in time, and I know Stan was definitely working, on deadline style in those early days. It's amazing what we got out of him and his collaborators that it made any sense at all. So
Well,
much less,
right.
Yeah.
And it's also, like my father, Stan was a product of the Great Depression. And so having work and having consistent work and wanting to keep working consistently is what kept him going. That sense that I could be on a bread line next week, right, is a strong motivator. And that's why, when I worked on the Superhero Squad games that I wrote, Stan was the mayor of Superhero City. And I remember specifically him telling me, Mark, my middle name is always available, right? Because he always wanted more work, right? He always wanted to work. And it was like, he loved working. And so that's why, later in his life, could he have retired? Yeah, of course he could have retired. And then, Marvel made him a wonderful lifetime deal. They finally untangled all the, the legal questions surrounding everything and made him this. He could have just, gone and sipped margaritas on the beach in Cancun. But, he wanted to keep working, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely his legacy, and I'm glad that he kind of got to see it fulfilled towards the end of his career, right? Hollywood was always the aim for Stan, like in terms of seeing his properties. He knew it was the future of Hollywood, and, amazing to live long enough to see that, come to fruition. Many people don't get to see their work appreciated in their lifetime. And
it's funny because I was just going to say, let me interject this. That's the way I felt when I saw the Avengers movie. I was like, okay, this is the fulfillment of my childhood dream of reading Avengers comics and them being one of my favorite superhero groups, and seeing it brought to life in such a realistic way. And that, I'll never forget that shot where they spin around them all, right? And it's that iconic shot. And it's like, yeah, now they can do this, right? It doesn't need to be animated. It's real people. It's all the effects work. It's completely believable. And I was like, yeah, okay, I'm in, right?
Yeah, it's a magical moment.
Yeah.
So, your career has been defined by working on a lot of these major properties, that we're probably, in your lifetime, you've watched them go from kind of niche cultural artifacts or interests to becoming like absolutely mainstream and very popular. Have these properties and working on this kind of like nerd space, if you will, like been your passion, and like what keeps you working on, obviously these jobs come in, you're not going to say no to them, but like it really has defined your career. So there must be, something to it that that keeps you there.
Well, I think, I like so many of us, I started just wanting to write. I spec'd live action scripts. I wanted to write in the live action space. I took college courses. I took UCLA extension courses in film writing and television writing. So that was really what I was looking at. But then working at Hanna-Barbera, they needed writers. At that time, Hanna-Barbera offered an animation writing course. So I took that just because, okay, let me see what the difference is. And back then, writing for animation was a slightly different skill set, because the way they would say it is that you're not just writing, you're also co-directing. So you would have to do shot calling, right? You would two shots immediately. That's all fallen away, thank goodness, because I don't want to hamstring the directors or storyboard guys. I want them to add to it what they add to it, right? And so it's now it's very much cinematic. Every script has merged into what is I'd say a cinematic style, right? And so I think that's good. But that's what I started looking at. That was the realm I wanted to be in. But then, you find all this really cool stuff. I mean, getting to write an animated series based on Back to the Future. I mean, how cool is that?
Yeah.
Right. And here's the weird thing. Each one of those episodes had a live action interstitial in them with Christopher Lloyd as Doc Brown, doing experiments that related to the episode. My episode was about baseball. So they actually put a spinning baseball on top of a little remote control DeLorean and ran it across the table with the ball spinning to show that curved balls actually curved.
Cool.
Right. Now, the other cool part about that was the guy who came up with the experiments and did the experiments. It was his first project in Hollywood. He'd come from San Francisco, and that was Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Wow.
And so that's where Bill got his start, right? So it's like, there's just been so much cool has happened, and I feel like I sort of like just stumbled into this career, and but I've had so much fun with it, and gotten to work on so much cool stuff. And also, I also started doing improv and stand-up comedy, so I've gotten to throw that into the mix too. One of the reasons John Semper hired me on Spider-Man the Animated Series was he liked my voice, and he wanted me to be able to add funny lines for Peter. Because one of the advantages we have, here's a great advantage that people don't think of when you're with Peter Parker, and it was established by Stan in the comics. You sometimes hear his thoughts.
Yeah.
Right? So not only can you add lines over just a shot of him looking one way or the other, right? You can change that line in post if you want, right? If you want to add a different line or make it funnier. Yeah. We'd sometimes come up with 3-4 lines, and you'd pick the one that was funniest or works best. But the other thing is, he's wearing a mask, so even when you have his mouth flap, you don't see his lips moving, so you can add new, funnier lines or different lines there, too.
He's the ultimate ADR character.
Right. I mean, same with Iron Man, actually, if Iron Man's in the suit, right? But like other characters, you don't, right? You can't do that with the Hulk, although the Hulk doesn't usually say much, but you can't, you can't do that with Thor, right? So it's like, it's a really great thing to do because it lends itself to, I think, making the character richer because you're experimenting and trying stuff. And it also gives the actors and the voice actors freedom to try stuff that they wouldn't necessarily try.
Well, there's a reason why Deadpool is the merc with a mouth, but you don't see his mouth, right? Because you need to be able to add more lines. Yeah.
Right.
You mentioned John Semper hiring you, for the series, but did that connection come about through your work with Saban? I know that they had a strong hand in producing Spider-Man the Animated Series. Was that a connection that facilitated that?
No, because Saban wasn't involved yet in that. Okay. In that first 5-year run of Spider-Man, Saban wasn't involved. It was Avi Arad, and Avi Arad was bringing Marvel was in receivership. And so Marvel had been bought by Toy Biz, the toy company, which was controlled by Avi Arad and his boss, Ike Perlmutter, right? So their big thing was like trying to sort of straighten out the mess that Marvel had become at that time, right? Late 80s, early 90s, Marvel had, I don't know if you remember, but, Spider-Man probably had half a dozen or more books that followed different Spider-Man storylines and different versions of Spider-Man, right? So the solution to try to dig themselves out of their hole was, we'll just publish more books.
Yeah.
It didn't work, right? So when Fox Kids came along and started doing stuff with what was Marvel then at the time, Avi's big thing was like, okay, how do we leverage these properties into making toys, but also making shows? Now, at the same time, he was going out and trying to sell movies. So the first season on Spider-Man the Animated Series, we weren't allowed to use certain characters because James Cameron was developing a Spider-Man film.
Sure.
Yeah, so we couldn't use Electro. We couldn't use...
I know he was planning on having Dr. Octopus.
We couldn't use Sandman either.
Okay.
So Electro and Sandman were the ones we were told we couldn't use. So that's why in the first season, or first or second season, you have Hydro Man, because we just subbed him in for Sandman, because they're basically the same character.
Well, John told me the story also of like why the Hobgoblin showed up first before the Green Goblins, because the toy was already made. There
was a lot of stuff like that. I remember one time Avi came into a meeting. He's like, Spider-Man has to have a van, and we're like, Spider-Man doesn't need a van, right? I mean, the guy can web anywhere in the city he needs to go. Well, he'd made a Spider-Man van toy, right? And it was a little remote control van, and we were like, okay. And, John, I remember, worked it out that like, okay, well, we'll have Peter Parker have a van that he buys secondhand from J. Jonah Jameson as his car, right? And it was like, okay, well, that was a way to solve it that fit with the logic of how the show worked, right? Because Spider-Man's not going to be driving around the city in his van, right? It doesn't make any sense. But everybody back then was just trying to figure out a way to keep the thing from going under, right? Because even and that's why they made these deals that you see now, deals like the fact that Sony controls Spider-Man basically in perpetuity so long as they have something there in development, because they needed those deals, right? they needed those deals, and so they had to make deals that there's no way they'd make that deal now.
Yeah. So, that show is kind of famous for its like long running arcs. I mean, like once you got into the later season to be an arc for an entire season, which was really unusual in animation at the time. I mean, obviously, like shortly thereafter, it became much more fundamental to children's entertainment. You've got like Pokemon but even those had kind of like episodes that lived on their own as part of a bigger arc. But you guys would do like 12-part stories.
We were completely breaking the rules as far as that goes, and it really happened after the first season because there was a lot of sort of craziness going on at the first season. John replaced the original showrunner, Marty Pasco, because just politics, right? There's always a lot of politics surrounding these shows. Initially, John tried to use a lot of comic book writers to write for the series because Marty Pasco had been doing that. It didn't work out because, writing for comics, in many cases, a lot of the comic book writers, they're auteurs, right? So they're given a lot of freedom for, okay, take your time, write this story, go for it, right? But television production is, we need that script next week.
Yeah.
It's recording Friday, and then it's got to go overseas to be animated, and we're not going to see it again for 10 months, right? So it needs to get done. And that's why then John realized, I got to hire staff writers. He hired Stan Berkowitz, he hired me, then he hired Ernie Altbacher and Jim Krieg. And so we were all, right? But that initial season, it was a lot of catch-up work because there was just stuff that was falling through the cracks. And everybody was throwing notes at it. The network was throwing notes at it. Marvel was throwing notes at it. It was just catching notes. And, even Stan, people were trying to define what it was. And you have the man who created the character in the room. Right. And I'll never forget, there was a meeting one time where Stan looked at some of the people and goes, people were talking about like, they wanted Spider-Man to be talking about Solzhenitsyn or something because he was facing Kraven the Hunter. And Stan was like frustrated. He said, "Can't he have an obvious thought? Can't he say, look at a glass of water and say, I'm thirsty, I want a glass of water," right? And it's like, yeah, it didn't mean the other people were wrong, right? But it meant that, sometimes Spider-Man's a kid, right? So don't try to adult him up all the time because both the humor and pathos comes from him being a kid. I mean, that's the whole point of his sort of tragic creation and, ignoring Uncle Ben's killer. I mean, he starts with tragedy, and it starts from being, sort of an emotionally immature jerk, right? And so sometimes, right, you're just going to hear what a kid thinks, and you can't really be afraid of that. And I think they've done that really, really well in the recent movies with the way he handles it with school. And those movies so remind me of, the comics, right? And what we were trying to do on the shows. It's really reminiscent to me.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think that gets kind of overplayed in adaptations of Spider-Man is like how smart Peter Parker is. I mean, he invented the web shooters and like, there's some things you have to kind of just get past, like that's like, okay, well, he has web shooters and a spider tracer and he makes his costume and whatever. But like, that doesn't mean he's like the biggest intellect. You can be smart and still make emotionally rash, immature decisions. And
and basically all those things he makes are for himself. They're sort of kid projects, right? It's like me, me building a little remote control thing in my room that I can drive out in the hallway to request a drink. My brother go get me a drink or something. It's almost, it's genius level, those kinds of projects, a spider tracer, but it's not. He's not making, a predator drone or, a nuclear submarine, right? So it had
not yet.
Yeah. I think so long as you don't lose sight of that sort of, what is the high school application of him, right? Because that's what he is, and that he's still trying to. I thought they did that so well in, was it the second Spider-Man with Michael Keaton?
The Spider-Man Homecoming was the first one with Michael Keaton.
Okay, yeah, but was
he
that
was
the
second
third of the new movies or third of the new movies?
That's the first of the new movies.
Is it?
Yes.
Okay. Wow. Okay. I lose track because he's also in the Marvel films, right?
Sure.
But I thought they did that really well with like, I'm a kid, he's an adult, I'm dating his daughter. I mean, it I just thought it was really, really well done, and, everybody, I'm just a kid, and I thought they worked that really, really well. I was really happy with how that went.
So with these kind of like long running storylines, like what was the writer's room on that series like, and like how were assignments handed out? I mean, you've written, I think it's 16 episodes of that show, but like it sounds to me like you were involved in the crafting of much bigger things than that. So like, how is that divvied up, and what's the room like?
Yeah, so I mean, we all sort of were. Once you had the staff, we would all sort of sit down, and they were divvied into 13 episode chunks, right? 13 episode seasons, right? So, and once the first season ended and people realized, okay, everything's running, he sort of has his voice. I like to think one of the big ones that did that was the Venom saga, because that was really our first multi-parter, and it really told a story. What was neat for me in working on that was I had not kept up with Spider-Man, so I wasn't aware of the Venom saga, so I got to read it for the first time before writing it, which was really cool and really neat, and I thought, well, this is great. And I really liked the character of Eddie Brock, and I thought, oh, there's some really cool stuff here. But yeah, we would do a lot of room writing, and we would decide like, okay, here are the stories we're going to tell, and in the later seasons it became like, okay, we're going to do Secret Wars, and we're going to really lean into this, because at the time, animation was all done, like there were a lot of 40 episode, 60 episode series being done, but almost all of them were individual episodes, simply for the production purpose that a lot of times, like on our series, we had 3 different overseas crews working. You had an A, B, and a C crew. And you would send these things off, and sometimes, right, the C crew would end up working through their episode faster. And if you were the network, you're like, okay, fine, then we'll air episode 7 before we air episode 10, right? And we'll just relabel them. And it made it, if you're not telling a continuous story, you can do that, right? If you're telling a continuous story, you can't do that. And that's why so many series of that era didn't do that. And that's why it was so groundbreaking. And now I think I think when streaming finally made that commonplace and made that the new paradigm, right? That it's like, oh, this is what we want to do, right? Then all of a sudden you look back at Spider-Man, you go like, oh, well, we were sort of ahead of the curve. The other thing that John did that was really smart was he wanted, well, first of all, he knew on a television budget, right, that chances are the visuals are only going to get you so far, right? It's going to be the story that drives it, because that's just the way it works with television animation, especially when you're making 65 episodes. You just don't have that much money to make episodes. So he decided the stories had to be a lot like a Spider-Man comic. And in order to make that work, you had to tell continuous stories, and you had to have a lot going on. Those scripts were long, and they were packed full of stuff.
And the actors speak really fast if you watch it back now.
Right. They speak really fast. A lot of stuff was going on, and again at that era, right? They didn't want a lot going on, right? They thought it would be too hard for kids to follow, and they thought, don't do this. And so I think we were sort of laying down the gauntlet, sort of challenging people. I think the X-Men did the same thing, right? With the stories they were telling. So it was interesting that those shows were being done in parallel on Fox Kids. Also Batman, the animated series, at the same time, right? So they were really realizing, okay, well, let's not talk down to the kids as much as possible. And so I think we would generally in the room come up with, okay, here's going to be this story for this season. It's Neogenic Nightmare. And so they're all going to kind of revolve this. And then we would sort of pick and choose, or John would say, I want to do an episode involving this bad guy or that bad guy. The other interesting thing was, right, we didn't have the internet, so you couldn't go look up Spider-Man series. So John had Marvel send out every Spider-Man comic that existed. So we had these huge file cabinets full of Spider-Man comics. And so many times we just go through the Spider-Man comics. I remember Jim Krieg wrote the episode, but I did the story for the Spot episode. And I found the Spot by opening that classic cover and going like, this is great.
Yeah.
We got to do this, right? And so that became a thing,
Sure.
we're going to do that. And so, and of course, some of that was to our detriment too. There were some that were like, is it Rocket Racer, the one in the big wheel, right?
No, that's Big Wheel.
Big wheel, right? Yeah. Which is, you just go, okay, that's kind of dumb. But
Yeah.
visually it looks interesting, right? When you see it on a cover, it's like, wow, okay, well, let's maybe we can do this. Maybe we can figure something like this. And we'd figure out how to figure that out into the longer story arcs. And then you have to do then the story arc servicing. Okay, so we need to allow room for 2 or 3 scenes every episode that we're continuing what the storyline for Neogenic Nightmare would be, or what the story for Six Forgotten Warriors is going to be, so that we can follow it, and that it makes sense. And yeah, the other weird thing that we couldn't do, that I worked on a show for Netflix in 2019, and called the original Mexican show is called Landis, but we called it Legend Quest, a really huge property in Mexico. But Legend Quest, they're sort of like Ghostbusters, but they're finding real monsters. And we did 2 episodes. The whole story has an arc, right? So it's exactly like what you expect from streaming now, right? It's a 12-episode arc. But halfway through that series, we did a head fake and made it look like our main characters were killed. And they would not let us do stuff like that, right?
Wow.
Because that's leaning into it too far. You can't do that. So
Sure.
Now we've been able to push those boundaries even further, right? That where you can do that, and you're really forcing the people. I got to watch the next episode because did the characters die, right? So, but we got away with being able to do a lot. 2 and 3 episode arcs that I Daredevil was another favorite of mine, so I got to help bring out the story for the Daredevil episodes, and that was really, really fun to me because there was a lot of intricate stuff going on there.
It's funny that you bring up the streaming comparison, because like what you said about your collecting of comics, and you would get the 2 parts of the story and be chasing for that one forever, was my experience of your show.
Right.
It was pre VHS. I wasn't able to record it in the moment, and so I would tune in each weekend hoping to get an answer to whatever missing hole that I had,
Right.
in the story, and I don't even think, because I don't think it was ever advertised as here's a 12, 13 part story. You kind of as a kid, I would show up and see what was there. And so, it was interesting to me to always uncover a new corner of a story that I didn't get, and so on and so forth. And I think the series has really greatly benefited from now being available in the streaming model.
Right. And what's weird is after the series ended, for the longest time, it was not available on either VHS or DVDs. Yeah. There was a rights issue, right? So it wasn't available. And I remember you could get a PAL copy from England for some reason, but people would be like, but now you got to have a PAL video machine to make it work. So for a long time, you couldn't see it. And it sort of lent to the lore of this show, right? And now that people can see it again and appreciate it and remember it and watch it, in the order, in the same way we now consume, right? Like I'm going to watch Breaking Bad all the way through again, or I'm going to watch Band of Brothers, something, right? You can now do that with Spider-Man. So it was really funny that for the longest time, you couldn't do that.
What was it like? You mentioned Batman, the animated series. What was it like doing a show in that era? I mean, I don't know that animated superhero things are really big, but that show was on in prime time. It really elevated the genre, which had been kind of flagging for a while. Whether it was the 60s, where the budgets were completely slashed for these things. And I'm sure all about that from your work with Hanna-Barbera in the history of that stuff. But the 90s reinvigorated animated television, whether it's Batman or your show. What was it like kind of being involved in that as it was kind of cresting and realizing that the potential was sky high?
Well, I think it was also, that was the era when, right, the Tim Burton Batman came out, right? So it wasn't actually a reimagining. It's funny, if you ever read Michael Uslan's book, the man who produced the original Batman, Tim Burton Batman movie, Michael Uslan's called The Boy Who Loved Batman. uh, he imagined, he wanted Batman to be portrayed as the Dark Knight, as the serious comic book character, and he'd only ever been portrayed by Adam West in the '66 series.
Right.
So very buffoonish, very clownish, for jokes and laughs, a guy in tights basically. And so I think that movie really kicked off like, oh, okay, these are dark characters with, we have the Joker is a very sinister villain.
Yeah.
The Dark Knight is really, Batman is a troubled guy, and so I think it kicked off a whole reimagining of how seriously these characters should be taken. And finally people woke up to like, oh, okay, that's how we can reimagine. That's what, and also just from a business point of view, they realize we're sitting on a gold mine, right?
Yes.
We have stories that we can tell across, right? It's the first true, some of the first true 4-quadrant stuff, as they call it now, 4-quadrant, right? So family and kids, so they could tell multiple stories across those lines, but treat it with a sort of seriousness that previously it hadn't been treated with, right? And even if you look at like some of the Marvel series from the '70s, which are, that sort of ridiculous Spider-Man, and my memories are of the Captain America with the motorcycle helmet, and it just you're just like, oh God, it looks terrible, right? And you realize like, well, yeah, to really make those suits look good, you need a technological solution, right? You need to apply technology to make that stuff work, right? And so when they finally could, they did, and when they finally decided we have to take it seriously, they found their audience, right? They found their audience, and they found a much wider audience, right, that was willing to look at these stories and learn about these characters.
Do you have a favorite episode from the animated series that you worked on, or you feel like you contributed the most to?
There's so many. I always say this though. One of my favorite teaser moments is from the original episode with the Daredevil, because it's such a great head fake, and it starts with Peter Parker's. We pan a courtroom. We see a judge bang a gavel. Peter Parker, I find you guilty of treason against the United States of America. And we hear, oh no, right? And it's Aunt May, and it's Mary Jane is there, and we pan and we see Matt Murdock sitting at the table. Don't worry, Peter will appeal, right? And like J. Jonah, I don't know if J. Jonah is there, but then we see Wilson Fisk is on the other side sitting in, people are watching this happen, right? It's like, you're going like, what's going? Quickly, the marshals they hustle him out of the courtroom. They put him in a van. He's in a motorcade. All of a sudden, boom, the motorcade's attacked. The doors swing open, and who's there to rescue Peter but Spider-Man? End teaser. And that's my favorite teaser because, it's such a misdirect. It's so different. It's funny. I saw some guy post something about it a few years ago, and he's like, well, yeah, if you look closely, you'll notice that the chameleon is wearing the chameleon's belt, so he's not really Spider-Man. And I was my response to that was like, well, yeah, because we still had to write it for 8-year-olds. So, we can't actually, right, make him look perfectly like Spider-Man, or, right, it doesn't work. But to me, that was like, that's almost the kind of beginning that you could have in a if you did Spider-Man as a 10-part streaming episode. That could be one of your teaser openings, right? And of course, that whole episode then introduces him to the Daredevil and Wilson Fisk, right? He discovers that whole side of that Marvel world is opened, to him, which was really fun. So that's one of my favorites. There's so many. It's like, I look back and go like, the Kraven the Hunter episode was fun. It had some really cool stuff in it. Again, the Venom stuff I found really, really fun.
I love the Venom stuff because I think a lot of the things that people like about Venom truly came from your show, not from the comic. The idea that the suit makes Peter an angry, aggravated version of himself was never in the pages of the comic. And there's a sort of like Mandela effect about it, where everybody assumes that they read it in the comic at some point in time, and yet it was never a thing. It was always from your show.
Well, it's very funny too, because we did so much stuff that I forget stuff that I think it was a part of Neogenic Nightmare. I don't remember, but there was a recent article that came out for the 30th anniversary where they interviewed a bunch of us, James Krieg and John Semper, and John said it was actually me in a meeting, one of these meetings where we're discussing story, where he said, well, we need Peter to be turning into something. What can he be turning into? And I was like, he's turning into the man spider, right? He's actually becoming a spider, right? And it was like, yeah, right? And so, right, that's when you were asking about meetings. That's sort of a lot of times how the meetings would go, right? We'd all sit around and everybody would throw something out, right? And you'd try to come up with this cool stuff. And that, what's interesting about that now is as I look back on it, between that, working on the series and doing all those permutations of Spider-Man, and then I went on to write Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, the game, for not Electronic Arts, for
Activision.
Activision, thank you, Activision Blizzard. And that, that also made use of different types of Spider-Man, and that had a neat. There were story issues when I came into that game because Dan Slott had written an outline, and then that outline became outdated because originally it was going to be we were going to use Doc Strange and Dormammu in that episode. Dormammu was going to be the bad guy, and then Marvel came and said, "Well, we've licensed them for a movie. You can't use them in the game. You can use Madam Web, and you can use." Who's the guy with the fishbowl head?
Mysterio.
Mysterio. You can use Mysterio, exactly. And my big thing then was like, well, if you're using Mysterio, he's not really a bad guy. He doesn't really have power. That's the whole sort of uniqueness of Mysterio. So I came up with this tablet. We'd use the tablet a time in Spider-Man, the animated series, and I came up with like the tablet of strength and time or something. Another
like life and destiny or something like that.
Something, right. But I decided, and if he's after this tablet, the tablet will give him real power, right? And if he gets a chunk of it at the beginning of the game, he has real power, you have to prevent him. And so that was really fun. So it has links to the show, right? It's sort of a link. And then for me, the really great find on that show was that was my first exposure to Spider-Man Noir. And I just fell in love with that version of the story. I just thought it was fantastic. I thought the way his depiction in the game was fantastic. In fact, that Christmas, I bought copies of Spider-Man Noir and gave them as Christmas gifts to all the other guys who we had written on the animated series. Everybody got a copy of Spider-Man Noir.
I thought you were going to say you gave it to like some kids. I mean, you're like, here, enjoy the cannibalistic vulture.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Coney Island vulture biting the heads off things. Yeah, but I thought it was just real. It's he wears that. That long coat, and he's got Uncle Ben's old flying cap. I just thought it was really a really great reimagining. So I'm glad that they now that Marvel has rediscovered it, with the Spider-Verse, that he's in there, right? I'm so happy.
And he's getting his own TV show now.
He's getting his own TV show, and it's great,
Well, I want to dig into all of that. So let's go back to get the conclusion of the animated series. And I could pick your brain about the animated series all day, but this is really the heart of why I wanted to have you on the show, because you kind of found yourself in the middle of something that I think kind of redefined Spider-Man, as you were kind of hinting at with like the idea of the Spider-Verse. But the thing I'm most interested in is like how these ideas are created and where they come from in a sort of collaborative way, whether it's, hey, the reason that there is a tablet of life and destiny is because Marvel literally told you couldn't do your first idea,
right.
The idea that like limitations are really what create innovation in art, right? Like it's being told what you can't do and having to come up with a solution that ultimately comes up with something wholly unique on its own. But there was a series of episodes in the animated series. I know you know this, but the listener may not know, called Spider Wars. And you wrote the episode, I Really, Really Hate Clones. And which, I think a lot of people in the 90s felt that way, having read the Clone Saga. I'm curious where the kind of idea for this team of spider people came from. John Semper Jr. has said, like, on Facebook, like, I'm the father of the Spider-Verse, you're welcome, Marvel. But when I had him on my show, he said that Avi Arad came to him and said, you have to use all of these spider toys, in one episode. And he was like, I don't know what to do. But like, you were in the room there. and I've not heard you proclaim anything. Like, what is your memory of like how this kind of idea of multiple spider people like teaming up together came to be? It's kind of an old thing. There was like the Wonder Woman bunch of different dimensions, and Captain Britain had a bunch of different versions of himself from Alan Moore in the comics. But this was the first time Spider-Man did it. What's your memory of that?
Well, my memory is too, right? We're late in a series. What would be a cool thing to do? I have no doubt that Avi came and said, I don't remember it specifically, and I might not have been in the meeting, but I have no doubt that Avi came and said, I need to sell all these toys, or I need new ideas for toys that we can sell, multiple Spider-Men. Because, right, that's always a thing you want to do, right? It's
right.
Like, it's a common toy thing, like, let's put Spider-Man in the black suit because, right, he's been in the red and blue suit. That one we can sell, right? That's a very common thing. Right. Unfortunately, it's true, but it is a business. And so this stuff comes out of both being told what you can do, what you can't do, deadline pressure, and what haven't we done before, right? Those are the kinds of things that sort of are the crucible that make up stuff like this coming together. And truth be told, I don't remember all of the exact, like I can't go back and point to like, there was a meeting in 1994 where we all sat down and said, we're going to create the Spider-Verse. Because nothing's that simple, right? It was just like, I think we thought we had something that would be a really great story and would be really fun and could be really, really cool, And I think, right, there've always, in a lot of cases, I think back to the classic Star Trek, the original series, where they have the foul up in the transporter and, right, Kirk ends up in the alternate Starship Enterprise, right? And they're really cool and they all have goatees, right? Even the women have goatees, I think. No, but, and of course, who helps him solve that issue but Spock, the alternate Spock who is still Spock, right? So it's like, I think everybody enjoys a story like that where you're given an alternate or something as, so long as you find a way to do it that is, it has its own internal logic and it makes sense and it hangs together, right? And so I think that series of stories with the clones, right? It actually, it came out of what we had already been doing. It probably was Avi saying, I need to sell more different kinds, can you give me toys that I can simply repaint the suit and he's a different version?
Right.
Sure, right? We can do that too, and so here we go, right? And then the interesting thing is a lot of those characters existed in the comics, right? They never appeared all together. They were just a version that might have appeared as a one-off, right?
Sure, like the disco suit armor, right.
Yeah. The armored spider, that kind of stuff, it was that, and there's a logic to it, right? And so I think we then decided, well, let's have all these guys together, right? Why don't we tell that story, because it's also, what's interesting there too is, right, I mean, there's also, you can get humor out of that too, right? If you have clones and, you put a clone with Mary Jane, right? It's like,
yeah,
it's automatically funny, right?
Sure.
Sort of. So I think it came out of just our desire to really tell good stories. And at that point in time in the series, that was the best place to lead those stories. And it, I think it made sense. I think it built on stuff that you'd seen in the comics. You just hadn't seen it in that form. You hadn't seen it put all together like that.
Sure. And I don't think, and stop me if I'm wrong here, but I don't think that there was any like grand Machiavellian like idea of, hey, we're inventing a whole new mythology of the Spider-Verse, more than it was a really neat idea for a story that perhaps people could build on in the future.
Correct. I think it was, we had the building blocks to do something like that. Nobody's going to tell us no, so we're going to do something like that.
Sure.
Because it's really cool and fun to do, right? I mean, because we were fans too, so we don't want to be bored telling stories, and we'd already been pushing the boundaries of what we could do with these characters. So what's something we can do that we haven't seen? Oh, how about this, right? And that's how it comes about, right? Same thing with, right, what I told you about Shattered Dimensions, right? It comes out of like, you can't do this, and you got to go here, and you got to stay in the lane, and it's like, yeah, but we're on a deadline, and how do we fix this, right? It's like, oh, okay, well, let's try this.
Or we have a
right?
gameplay idea. How do we match story to that, right?
Exactly,
because
exactly.
that's how games are designed, is usually mechanics of character movement and gameplay ideas before story gets mapped on top of it.
Right. In some cases, in the case of that game, they were sort of developing in parallel on that game, which was kind of cool. But it was nice to be able to sort of go into the well of deeper knowledge of Spider-Man and figure that out, and that was even before Dan Slott was doing anything with the Spider-Verse too, right? So that was all, again, it was just a cool way in the game. How can we do different versions of Spider-Man, right? Sure. Right? And nobody labeled it the Spider-Verse, right? So
yeah, and I definitely want to ask you about that in a second. But I do want to go into something incredibly nerdy that maybe you've not heard about.
Okay.
And I'm curious to hear your reaction to this. So, in doing research on like myself independently on the birth of the Spider-Verse, and rereading Amazing Spider-Man comics, I own a full collection of Amazing Spider-Man, and so I get to read the letters pages, which are always a really interesting insight into like what's going on in the minds of the fans, how they're reacting to things. Mm-hmm. And in the kind of like years after Secret Wars, in the like kind of early 90s, a reader named Monty wrote in to an issue of Spider-Man saying, hey, Secret Wars was such a hit. Like, why don't you guys do something like that with Spider-Man? You can call it Spider Wars, and Spider-Man will meet up with all of the various different Spider-Men from different universes. And the editors were like, that's a great idea. Like, let's see what the fans say about it. And it gained a life of its own. Reading more comics, I was like, oh, they kept bringing up Spider Wars in the letters pages and proposing ideas for it. And the even funnier, the letters page that this first appeared in is the comic that first introduces Carnage, who ended up being the villain of your guys' Spider Wars.
Right.
Yeah. Do you know if there's any connection there, or is that just freak random coincidence?
That, as far as I know, that is freak random coincidence, because at that time we were kind of bifurcated from the comic book people.
Yeah.
We weren't.
Well, this was like several years preceding your guys' story.
But they were so like sort of trying to stay afloat, right?
Yeah.
While we were sort of busy making it. So we didn't have a lot of interaction with them.
Sure.
Later on, while working on some Spider stuff, right? I remember talking to Joe Quesada and stuff about later versions of Spider-Man I worked on. But on the animated series, it was like the New York people were doing their New York thing, and we were out here in LA doing our LA thing. The sort of only connecting cog. I mean, even Stan was not really tapped into what was going on in New York. The only connective tissue was Avi Arad. And Avi was really focused on the movies and the TV shows and getting all that made. And that's why he had made a connection then with, you mentioned Saban earlier. So after Spider-Man, the animated series, and X-Men, then Saban got the rights to do a bunch of the Marvel stuff. Because I then did Silver Surfer there, and I did Spider-Man 2099 there. I'd heard a story that they were considering doing a Daredevil series. I was so excited. And then I'd heard in a meeting that some of they were discussing it at Saban, looking at it. Someone said, blind lawyer, nah. And I was like, wow, really? Casually just crossing it off, right? At that time, they had talked about doing a Captain America series, and they decided it was too America-centric. They didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
And which I was like, what? But so everybody was sort of so hyper-focused on their little area of trying to get stuff done that there was not the kind of cross-collaboration. So might it have happened accidentally? Might somebody have said, the idea of doing this or doing that? Yeah. But
or somebody reads that comic and it sticks in their head in some way?
Maybe. I'm not going to...
Yeah, no, I mean
entirely
it's just
right?
a really weird coincidence.
I mean,
so.
it's a weird coincidence. It's really interesting, but it's also one of those things where it's like, when you hear, and especially pre the meme era, right? When you would hear a joke that you thought you'd thought up or some funny
Sure.
word, and all of a sudden you hear it from somebody across the country, and like, well, obviously, fertile ground for a joke, produces jokes from multiple places around the country, right? So I know, as far as I know, nobody ever came to us and said, oh, you should do something like this with Spider Wars, right? It just became, right? A good idea is a good idea,
I find it. That's the thing. I find it interesting, like that parallel. I mean, these letters preceded that arc on the show by a number of years. But I do find it funny that there was like, even if it's just coming out of the heyday of Secret Wars, which I know you guys did right before Spider Wars as well. But there is a sort of funny track that like the comics went one direction and then maybe completely unbeknownst to that going on in the comics, you guys were thinking a similar way, which almost suggests that there's maybe like a natural order for how these things proceed,
and in a lot of cases we were using the comics. We could use comic stories for inspiration, but there, sometimes there were problematic adult themes in the comics we couldn't use. Just particularly talking about Venom and Carnage. Carnage was incredibly problematic for a kids show, right? We had to really, Cletus Cassidy's a serial killer, right? So I mean, that's not going to go on a kids show, right? But that was. Right, that came out of like them seeing, well, Venom's really popular. We need to have more Venom, but we can't. But Venom's a bad guy, so how do we make him sort of an anti-hero? Let's make a worse version of Venom, right? That's how that sort of came out from the comics. So that was sort of all sorted, and that works in a comic world, right?
Sure.
Where you can have this guy he's so horrible that Venom looks great, right?
Is that how the Carnage symbiote ends up on Peter Parker in your show, so that it's not Cletus Cassidy, the serial killer underneath?
Yeah, and I mean we had Cletus Cassidy, but it is such a watered down version, right?
Sure.
That you can't, because you can't use killer, you can't say serial, right? I mean, it's like unless it's Fruit Loops, right? So it's like we already knew going in that okay, that's problematic to go there. That's why, like, if you watch the Venom saga, it's completely divorced from Carnage at that point in time because we didn't even know we could use him yet, right?
Sure.
We didn't know if we'd be allowed to use him. Now, finally, later on, same thing with like if you look at some of our ridiculous stuff with Morbius, right? Where he's out after your plasma and he's got suckers on his hands,
right? Yeah,
we can't show blood. He can't have fangs. He can't have teeth that he can't bite anybody, right?
Yeah.
So. But that, again, I'll bring that back to Star Trek, the original series. It gave me insight into the salt vampire from Star Trek because they must have, at that point in time, way back when, broadcast standards and practice also didn't allow them to show blood or have teeth biting people in the neck. So that was their solution, too. And so I was like, oh, wow, we have this weird link to Star Trek in us trying to get around what the network will allow us to do.
Honestly, hand suckers are way more disturbing than biting. Like that's nightmare fuel, right there.
I know, right?
Yeah.
And just sucking stuff out of you. Yeah, and also they had all those creepy images with him like this and the suckers on his hands.
Yeah, I don't like porous stuff in general, but hand suckers not
but,
super hot.
A lot of that stuff. Again, we're having to create stuff around being told what we can't do. And so that's why. That's why Carnage is so different in our series because they were and they had a lot of eyes on it, right? Making sure we're not going to step over any lines to make him right. So, and that's where you get those delineations between what the comics can do and what we can do. But there wasn't a lot of cross-pollination. Like I said, we weren't sharing storylines or anything.
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot more of that is done now.
But you did have a lot of stuff that was like pulled directly out of comics from like years prior. Like Ben Reilly shows up and he was like all the rage at the comic simultaneously, So
yes.
It was pretty tied into it. Let's move on to Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions. One of my favorite games. I know it doesn't have the free roaming city stuff,
Yeah.
but like I love the tight narrative, linear levels of that game and all of the writing that went into that, which I have you to thank for partially. I thought it was a really fun game. You got to do Deadpool before Deadpool was a thing.
That was really my first introduction to Deadpool, right? So was having to read up on Deadpool for that, and I was like, well, this guy's awesome, right? I was like, this is a really different modern take on a character,
And you got to invent like brand new villains for the different universes and interpretations on those characters. I'm sure it must have been fun.
Well, the other great thing was, they did all that great Stan Lee narration stuff, and there are multiple versions of all of that they did where Stan did multiple, hello, true believers. And he had all this stuff because we wanted that in there, and they took great care with doing, like, they really put time and effort into all the cutscenes, into explaining how this story worked. It's been a while since I've played it, but I believe you can choose your path to which versions of Spider-Man you're going to first or second, right?
I don't know if it changes the narrative when you do that, but yes, you can choose.
I don't think it changes the narrative, but you can choose your path, right?
Correct.
So they were sort of exploring how you can do that, right? And then just also the genius of getting voice actors who had all played Spider-Man in different versions of Spider-Man to again be the different versions of Spider-Man. So I think the cool thing about that is that people all of us working on that show had sort of a reverence for the, Spider-Man and for that material. And so you want to see those ties to, how it was all done and who was all in it.
Yeah. So, how did you get on that game? Was it like purely off of your work doing the show? Was that the appeal to bringing you on board?
Yeah, that was part of it. So I'm pretty sure this is how it happened. They called my agent because they were looking for someone to write the game because Dan Slott was going to do just an outline of the story, but then his obligations for writing on the comics was such that he couldn't do the whole game.
Sure.
So then I had come off the series, and so they're like, oh, well, Spider-Man, you're perfect, right? So I remember going in and meeting and seeing the concept of what they were going to do, and I thought it was really cool. And the other thing is I'm a gamer, right? I've been a gamer since I was a kid. I was a tactical gamer. I was a D&Der, right? So I've always sort of existed in that world of like, I game and I write, and I've also written games because I like games, right? I really like playing games. I have a good time with it. And so being able to contribute to games that I'm like, okay, I'm going to bring... And always when I write a game, I sort of try to bring that, because like you were saying, a lot of gaming studios want to we're going to come up with what the gameplay is first before putting the story in. And I've been on some games where it's early enough that the story is being developed along with the gameplay. And I always say, I think in a lot of cases, game studios look at writing as like sort of alchemy, that they don't understand it, and I'm going to come in and ruin their cool levels. And my point is like, no, but I'm going to show you how you could take your levels and even levels that already exist. Maybe, why don't we make this the climax battle? And why don't we have the story be about this? And why don't we have that be the denouement? And so I always approached it as if I was writing a big arcing episode of television. And I would also deliver like, I'm going to give you 4 or 5 premises for what I think this game should be. And you'll get to tell me what you think. And you can pick one. You can mix and match from all of them. Then we'll do an outline, just like we do in television. And then we'll write the script, and changes are made at every level. Because, as I would say, we write scripts. We've gotten really good at developing television, coming out of radio, coming out of plays here in the United States. We're really good at it.
Yeah.
And so we can apply that same paradigm to writing games. And then you get a really high quality, at least in my experience, you get a really high quality story in a game. Because sometimes, like you said, I can always tell, okay, this looks like a game where they just added dialogue after they'd already figured it all out, right? Or somebody did this level and no writer looked at it and said, why in this level are we just running through, a giant airplane graveyard, and this isn't a hide and go seek level, right? Which would be much more fun, right, and interesting. But so that that came out of them starting with story, right? You know, they sort of started with story, but they also had all these cool versions of Spider-Man that they already wanted to use, right? So it was like, oh, okay, they already know they want to do this. So
That's great. And
to
that
me,
was
it
already
really
in
great.
place when you came on board.
Yes, that was already the setup, and so I was like, oh yeah, bring it, you know.
You know, how is that transition for you career wise? I mean, that game was really kind of at the onset of this whole like kind of narrative movement in gaming. You know, it's like pre Batman Arkham Asylum. You know, so like
Yeah.
before it kind of that model got really adapted for superheroes. And you know, there have been like Spider-Man the movie game, and it was all like you said. I think kind of like, maybe we'll loosely follow the movie, but it wasn't thinking in the way you described denouement arcs.
Right.
You know, the kind of classical storytelling style. You know, Shattered Dimensions, if I'm not wrong, is kind of around the same time that Naughty Dog made that shift for themselves into like Uncharted and doing these kind of more linear narrative oriented titles.
Yeah.
So like, I'm curious on two ends, how is it for you to go from the medium of television to video games, if medium is truly the message, as Marshall McLuhan likes to say, or is coined? You know, like what did you have to change? And then what did you have to convince them to kind of change about their approach?
Well, for me, like, and this sort of applies in general to all, like, when I work on a game or whether I work on television. I have always, like, because I like gaming and I feel like I can sort of talk to the people that work gaming. You know, a lot of the people in the levels of power in the gaming world, a lot of them are programmers, right? So it's like they have a very linear thought process, right? Programming is very linear, right? It is a logic problem, right? Mm-hmm. In many cases.
Yeah.
And so, but they think story is some, right, wizard's thing, right? That does. And so I would come in trying to show them, no. Story is its own logical progression. And here's how the progression works. And once they would sort of see that and realize, like, I remember having initial meetings on a game a few years ago, and I could just tell in the room that these guys were like, you know, they're afraid I'm going to come in and mess all kinds of stuff up, and I don't like gaming, and, you know. And then a conversation gets struck up from two different points of view where I say, you know, like, look, I can show you guys sort of the way gaming works or the way story works as a you know, a linear progression and as a logic progression and how we tell a story. And then we started talking about the games we were playing at the time. And I don't remember what I was playing at that time. I think I might have been playing Deus Ex Machina, the original Deus Ex Machina, which I loved.
Great game, yeah.
Great game. It had all these cool original endings. I went back and played all the original endings. It was great because you could decide, am I going to be a stealth character? Am I going to be a butt kicker? What am I going to be, right? And so you could mod yourself up. It was one of those earliest games that the story was really intriguing. I remember these really cool levels. And I think we started talking about, and they realized like, oh, well, he's a gamer. I can talk to him like he's a gamer, right? Not just like, oh, he's some writer. The other problem is, I think, in many cases, gaming studios will go out and they'll go find some highfalutin screenwriter or big television writer, and they'll hire them, and that guy who doesn't know games is just going to take their money and I hate to say it, but it's true, crap something out and be gone with their money. And then it gives everybody in Hollywood a bad reputation rather than looking for the people like, yeah, I actually like games, and here are the games I'm playing now. And if you want to sit down and talk about Balatro, or you want to sit down and talk about Sniper Elite, I'll have those discussions with you because I'm actually playing those games. I actually like those games. I find something new in all of them, right? I like the history of gaming. My brother works for 2K, so he's a gaming producer. So it's like I know about that world, and so, and I think I think you can still see it out there. There's still a tension between the people that feel like, okay, it should all be about the cool levels and the gameplay, and I don't care about a story. And I will still always say that, like, look, if you're spending $30 to $100 million on a game, right, and you want to kind of guarantee return or some sort of return on that game, how about you spend, a small fraction of that money to give it a really great story, right? And then, the other problem is, though, with writing for games is, right, so if I write a half-hour story, that's about 200 lines. For Spider-Man,
Sure.
the animated series, about 240 lines, or 45, because we wrote a lot, right? As you said, they talk a lot. A game can be
Right.
thousands of lines, right?
Yeah.
Thousands of lines, right? And so it's like, okay, I remember when I did Kung Fu Panda 2, the game, for THQ, which no longer exists as a gaming studio, but also for DreamWorks. And I think the character of Poe, the panda, I want to say he had like maybe 1,800 lines, something like that. So the character actor we got, Mick Wingert, very talented. At that time, he was doing, when Jack Black couldn't do stuff, he was doing sound alike to Jack Black, and he sounded just like Jack Black. And we put him in the studio. We saved him for the last like 3 days of recording. We said, dude, you have all these lines to do. So here's what we want you to do. Just give us 3 versions of each line. If there's no problem and we don't stop you and we don't have a correction, just keep going. Let's see how many we can get done. And I remember he like put like a jacket on his head and like the earphones on, and he just like went. He just went, right? And we saved all the efforts, all the yeah, whoo, ha. We saved that for the last day so it wouldn't ruin his voice. And he just went. He just had to do 1,800 lines, right? And so it's like, yeah, that can be the challenge in keeping it fresh. But if you come in with a baseline of a really good story, right? It's just like, to me, it should be like a movie. It should be like, the game should be like experiencing a movie. And I think, the really best Marvel games do that. I think, some of the best superhero games do that, and then I'm anxious to play them, right?
How did having like all those big names, Neil Patrick Harris, Christopher Daniel Barnes, Paul Soules, coming back, and not necessarily playing the same character that they played before, but how does that impact you when you're writing it? Did you know immediately that they would be reading your lines?
No, that was so it was already written when they got all those guys to come in.
Okay.
They knew they were going to try to do that, right? As sort of like just to keep the homage, but also the the fanness going on that. So the producers, that was their whole vision. They were trying to do that. Same with, we want these lines for Stan Lee. So it was written independent of who they were going to get, because you never, right? You don't know who you can get necessarily to be whom. So we were just sticking with like, Spider-Man Noir had to be sort of that hard-bitten,
sure,
30s character, Amazing Spider-Man. We had to find the way they were delineated mainly by the comics, right? And then they just sort of brought in the voice actors. They had to look at it independent of which version of Spider-Man they played, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I thought that was always interesting because, Christopher Daniel Barnes comes back as a more like hard-edged Spider-Man, and it's like, oh no, that guy was the like nicest Spider-Man that ever existed. You know?
He was this one. I still have my talking Spider-Man. I replaced his batteries too.
Out of web fluid. Here's your favorite wall crawler. Yikes.
That's my favorite. That you get a button push and you get yikes. I mean, come on.
Spider-Sense going berserk.
That's
well, they didn't have you writing it, so
yeah, exactly.
There's the problem. So I want to talk about following that thread of the development of the game. You come on, they've already got this idea of multiple Spider-Men there. Dan Slott is involved with kind of like plotting it ahead of time. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if there is a thread from Spider-Wars into Shattered Dimensions. I mean, obviously you come along with that, but like, again, I'm curious, did Beanox develop this kind of idea, or Dan Slott develop this sort of like connective tissue completely independently of that? And just like me describing the letters pages, it was another group of people stumbling upon the joy of putting multiple Spider-Men together? Or is there actually a connective tissue there that that sees the through line from the Spider-Wars in the cartoon to the video game?
Well, obviously what I like to say, yes, it was my genius that put those, but in all honesty, I have to say no. The real connection I remember adding into that was the tablet, right? Bringing the tablet from that. That to me was like, that solved a story issue we had, right? And like I said, I don't think anybody, Beanox was working on these cool different versions, and they were doing all the art stuff and all the cool, web slinging and like unique stuff like when Spider-Man Noir, his really cool, unique spider sense,
Sure.
right? Those gray lines in when he'd be down dark alleys and stuff. And I don't think I don't remember Dan, we weren't talking about Spider-Verse yet at that point in time. Nobody was, right? So
Yeah.
I think we all just sort of like, well, this is a cool thing. We're going to have these cool different versions of Spider-Man. And I think it just, again, the germination of multiple ideas across, stuff that's really cool, stuff that really works, stuff that sort of resonates with you. And particularly in that game because it had a beginning and a middle and an end. Already when I came in, we already knew where it was going to go. Obviously Spider-Man's going to win and different versions of Spider-Man, and it was going to be Doc Strange having the interface to show him all these different, and it became Madam Web. Now, when I look on that, I'm kind of like, actually Madam Web's a better character to do that.
Absolutely.
Right? I think than Doc Strange, right?
Yeah.
And so and Madam Web is more related to Spider-Man, and the fact that it's Mysterio, I think we made it work, right? It's kind of cool, right? I've always thought he was a cool looking villain, even though he's not really a badass. He doesn't really have powers, but he's so cool looking, right? And of course, I also like it because Spider-Man, you can come up with all kinds of gags for the guy with the fishbowl
head.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. All kinds, right? There's all kinds
Sure.
of stuff, right? Planetarium brain, there's all kinds of stuff you can come up with. So, but it all sort of, again, I remember on that project coming in and we're already behind, right? Already we're behind, right?
Yeah.
So you sort of just focus on like, oh, okay, what do we got to get done when, right? The deadlines come at you so fast in either television or gaming. For gaming, it's all, we got to make the beta date, right? And, we didn't do this so much on that game because I was doing the writing, but, they're going to be getting bug reports back. And then now they got to filter through all the bug reports, right? And it's like, so there's so much going on that, no, we never. I think it just all sort of happened, right?
Sure.
It's sort of like sometimes it's hard to pinpoint where what was that point,
Well, it's interesting the Madam Web thing being like an accident because it like kind of makes sense out of that character. Like she was a
absolutely.
Denny O'Neil creation that nobody really touched. I mean, Roger Stern did that great Juggernaut story with her, but like
Right.
I don't think anybody knew what to do with a psychic web-based character, and suddenly putting her at the center of an item that connects these different Spider-Men and, just makes so much sense as to who this person actually is. And the thing that like wowed me the most looking kind of back at the game in the hindsight of Spider-Verse is those final images of the game with that web that comes out behind her that shows all
Right.
the different spider people in the pieces of the web, because
Right.
that's ultimately what Slott would end up doing with his Spider-Verse series, is depicting it as this great web that connects everything. And obviously that's in the movies now.
Right.
Was that just a fun visual that came up, or was there an idea behind that at the time?
As
you
far
can
as I
remember?
know, that was just a fun visual that came up. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't remember that but I don't remember it necessarily being in the writing. I think that was just a visual way they came up with it. I do remember, right? Like I wanted one of it to be Spider-Ham. I wanted to have like an after credit scene of Spider-Ham. Am I too late?
Yeah.
Right? I just saw that happening, right?
Yeah.
So I was like, and they're like, yes, do it. I'm like, okay, good, right? And it just sort of fit with everything Marvel was doing, right? So it's like, okay, we got to do that, right? And that's why I think somewhere in one of those cut scenes is Spider-Man just points and goes, "Is that a pig?" Right? It's
Yeah.
like, right? So to me, yeah, I mean, when I look back on it now, I go like, yeah, even let's say, even if we could have used Dormammu as the bad guy, I would have still chosen Madam Web over Doc Strange.
Yeah.
Just because I think Madam Web is more intrinsic to Spider-Man's world,
Yeah, and it's just funny, like that, like these decisions that seem almost arbitrary go on to have like a huge life of their own,
Right.
that influence this character and pop culture in the way that they have. So like I talked to Dan Slott, and he told me that like, the genesis of Spider-Verse coming out of that is he called his editor up and said, I love this idea for this game. Like, why don't we do that in the comics, but with every Spider-Man ever? Was that ever a discussion that you had with him? I don't know how close your relationship was.
No, I only talked to Dan a couple of times because, like I said, he was so busy with the, his comic book work that after our original discussions over his story, and then when we had to sub in Madam Web and Mysterio, then he sort of had to go on and do other things. So then it was sort of just left to me to, grind out, get most of the writing done. And then they also finally brought in, I can't remember his name, another writer who had to help, because as we got towards the deadline crunch, there's just so much stuff that needs to get done. Right.
And I'm sure it's changing all the time. I mean, that game had like so many different modes and things like that. Right. I mean, even when you fight the bosses, it goes into first person, and I'm sure that presented a writing challenge, all of its own. So that I'm sure I could pick your brain, and I'd love to, on a later date, maybe go through it in more detail. But I did want to, because we are going long, I did want to ask you about Lego Marvel Superheroes.
Oh, yeah. That was
you've
fun.
done a number of projects on that, but that first game was just really mind-blowing in regards to how many characters were in it, how many inside jokes there are to Marvel. I played it for probably hundreds of hours and still didn't, get to the bottom of the bucket of all of the things. Can you talk about working on that property? I mean,
that was super fun because I'd done a lot of work on Marvel games. So TQ Jefferson, who was the head of Marvel games at the time, recommended I work on that. And it was just super fun because I remember what drew me to it was like, well, it's going to be this sort of the first version of an open play Marvel New York world, right? And I'm like, well, then you sort of realize, oh, yeah, nobody's ever done that. Why has nobody ever done that?
Or since.
Right. And it's like, and then the other great thing that, because that's Traveler's Tale, right? That did that game. Right. Yeah. And so they had a really good handle on it. They were big fans. So that helped. But the other thing that they brought to it that I thought was really great was they wanted to populate it with all these side quests and different characters and unlockable versions of characters, right? So that was really fun in that approach to it was like, wow, this is really different and unique. And then, of course, that Lego sense of snark, right? That you can do these characters and they're throwing off one-liners and they're doing, it's funny, so many of the Lego versions of Marvel characters I've done, a lot of times that involves Thor. And I go so over the top with Thor because he's already over the top. So I'm like, I will always get, you went too far with Thor. Okay. Yeah, you got to pull back a little with Thor because I'm like, well, yeah, okay. Really? But that one was super fun. I remember that was super fun too because it's like, oh, you have some more side quests? It's like, yeah, we're going to do a side quest with this character, that, and then what was neat was even after my time ended with that game, they were adding more and more content. Right?
Sure.
They were doing all this stuff. And so that was also around the era when like downloadable content, DLC for stuff was sort of a new concept. And so the idea that you could refresh these games and do stuff, and now I look at like, Baldur's Gate 3 and, I'm super stoked that they're coming out with the final patch that's going to have like, I guess, 12 different subclasses that you can be, but it's like that kind of stuff, right? Sort of started back in that era when they were doing, Lego Marvel Superheroes. So they had a plan for all that downloadable content, and it's like, wow, this is really cool that you can make this deep a world, and like your game systems can support it, right? That they figured out a way to. Your console can support it. Your PC can support it. Right? It all works.
That snark you mentioned too is kind of like an early, version of the MCU. Like you say, Thor was silly,
right?
But then the MCU made Thor silly. It's kind of the language of Marvel. Like Lego is kind of the perfect fit for those characters to kind of make fun of themselves in some way.
I remember. It's very funny. I worked on the Lego Frozen special, and we had to go pitch it over at Disney to the guy who was at that time running Disney Animation, and he had been one of the founders of Pixar. Why can't I think of his name? It'll come to me. But I remember him. He talked about how much he loved the fact that Lego, we could do all this snarky stuff, right? Because so many legacy Disney characters had become so precious that it's like, what do you do with Winnie the Pooh now? Right? Is it,
Yeah.
he was like, it sort of feels like that character is designed to be in utero, right? Because it has such a young sensibility. Whereas Lego allows you this take on characters that can make even, right, the sort of most precious thing fun, right? And different. What's the angle, and how do we do it? And you can almost, because Lego has such a friendly vibe to it, and I've worked so closely with Lego and worked on their series, they just like doing that, right? And it's really, really fun. The Danes have a great sense of like making fun of themselves, Get
me Lego the Bible and Lego the Quran. Not Lego the
Quran. But one of the things that a lot of times on Lego projects they would let me do is the Easter egg I would always try to sneak in was the very first Lego toy was a wooden duck that the founder of Lego, and it was a little pull duck. And so I would always try to fit the Lego duck into as many Lego things as in fact, when I worked on their series Nexo Knights, I wanted to do a take on the Trojan horse, but it be a giant duck that our heroes
funny.
get in, and they pull it in a castle, but they wouldn't let me do it. And I was like,
So
get that
sensitive.
duck into it. I know, get that duck into as many things as we can,
So sensitive. Well, you've been really generous with your time. And so I want to end the interview by asking you a question that we ask everybody who comes on the show,
okay.
Which is to say, what does it mean to you on a personal level to have been part of shaping the legacy and world of a character like Spider-Man?
To me, it's been really sort of fulfilling and fun. And I think here's where it came home to me was years ago, I had to do a panel. This was when Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions came out. And I had also worked on, I think, a Superhero Squad game. And I was doing the panel down at Comic-Con for the games. And my oldest son was in the audience. And there were other people who had written other Marvel games. And when I got done with it, my son looked at me and he goes, yeah, Dad, but Shattered Dimensions is still the best. Right? And it felt so good that I'm like passing on sort of this love of Spider-Man to like new generations, including my son and including other people and other kids. And the other way I like it is, and this is something that I tied into with Lego, because I played with Lego as a kid, right? My kids played with Lego. The idea that can I write a series or a work that involves Spider-Man that makes a classic reference to Spider-Man or a Spider-Man comic, that dad in the room or mom in the room will laugh, that the kid will laugh at something else, that they'll have this moment that they can bond, right? That they can watch it and appreciate things on different levels. And I think Marvel does that really, really well. And I think characters like Spider-Man do that really, really well. And so it feels like, now that I look back on the fact that, Spider-Man the Animated Series was 30 years ago, it's only become in the last few years that it's, when I mention it to people, that just sort of the look of awe on their face and the look of like wonderment. And I realized like, I was a part of all these people's childhoods, and it really meant something, and it made a deep and lasting impression on them. And that feels really, really good. It feels like, okay, the work that I did, for a paycheck, and I liked it and I really loved it, but it has had it's made a lasting impression on people. And I think it's a really cool thing to be a part of.
Well, in response to that, I want to say thank you too. That series was hugely instrumental to my childhood, and now, whenever that little snowball that started at the top of the hill has become a boulder to the point that I'm 13 years or so into podcasting about Spider-Man. maybe there was a
Cool.
better snowball to go with, then maybe it could have been, like a philosophy. Who knows? But it ended up being Spider-Man, and it's meant a lot to me. And I want to say thank you. Your work was deeply influential to my life and helping me feel less alone as a kid. So,
Well, cool. Thanks, Dan.
yeah.
I appreciate that. I'm glad.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'd love to have you back on and dive into this
Sure.
stuff in greater detail. But for now, where can our listeners follow you, whether that's online? Maybe you've got something you're working on that's coming out.
Here's the problem. I have stuff I'm working on, but, stuff is not coming out for the year, right? Because
Yeah.
that's the way it works in animation, all that stuff.
Sure.
I do improv comedy and stand-up around Los Angeles. You can follow me on Instagram at Hoff, Hoff comedy. That's the first part of my name and comedy. I'm on LinkedIn. I usually accept almost everything on LinkedIn unless you're trying to sell me something. Unless you're trying to sell me crypto, sorry. And so yeah, I'm hoping maybe there's some more. I worked on a series for Lego again this year, which is fun. So hopefully I can talk about those episodes that are coming out here soon too.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I hope everybody goes and follows you, and we hope to talk to you again soon.
Cool. Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it.
All right, it's that time for all good things to come to an end, at least in regards to this show. So I want to thank you, the listeners and viewers, for tuning in to this episode of The Amazing Spider Talk. Plus, a special thank you to writer Mark Hoffmeier for joining us. I really enjoyed talking to him and hope to have him back on, perhaps for a deeper dive into the animated series and Shattered Dimensions, two things that I know that you guys would love to hear more about. But if you want to support us in continuing our journey into all of the various ephemera of Spider-Man, this podcast can only exist because of the support of our listeners on Patreon. So for only $3.99 a month, that's less than the price of a new issue of Amazing Spider-Man, you can help support our show's existence while getting early episodes, including these interviews as soon as we record them, our single issue reviews, exclusive artwork, and a ton of other bonuses. So a thank you to everyone who has already supported us and our work. If you value smart comics criticism and historical analysis, we hope you'll consider supporting us on that Patreon. What we do on the show is admittedly niche. It is a niche. Still, we feel that we offer unique commentary and model fair methods of criticism for a character and medium that rarely receive the kind of consideration we believe they deserve. So please, if what we do is valuable to you, we can only continue doing what we do with your support on Patreon. So, until I find myself teaming up with alternate versions of myself to stop a multiversal threat and sell toys, our motto remains, with great podcasts, there must also come the amazing Spider Talk.